Sarah Martinez had always been the adventurous type. At 32, she was an experienced marine biologist who had spent years studying coral reefs in the most remote corners of the world. Her passion for underwater research had taken her from the Great Barrier Reef to the hidden depths of the Caribbean, but nothing had prepared her for what would become the most terrifying and miraculous experience of her life. The research vessel Deep Current had been her home for the past 6 months as she conducted a groundbreaking study on deep-sea coral formations near the Mariana Trench. The project was ambitious, requiring her to dive to depths that few humans had ever explored. Sarah's team included Dr. Michael Chen, a marine engineer, Captain Rodriguez, who had 30 years of experience navigating dangerous waters, and 3 other marine specialists. On that fateful Tuesday morning in September, the weather conditions seemed perfect for their planned dive. The ocean was calm, with gentle swells and clear visibility extending for miles. Sarah checked her equipment one final time before suiting up in her state-of-the-art diving gear. The personal emergency beacon device, a small waterproof transmitter that every team member wore, was securely attached to her dive suit. It was designed to activate automatically in life-threatening situations or could be triggered manually. "Remember, we're going down to 300 meters today," Dr. Chen reminded her as she prepared for the dive. "The underwater cave system we discovered last week needs proper documentation before the weather turns." Sarah nodded confidently. She had made this type of dive hundreds of times before. Her expertise in deep-sea exploration was well known in the scientific community, and she had never had a serious accident in her 15-year career. As she descended into the crystal-clear waters, she felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with exploring the unknown. The underwater cave system was even more spectacular than their initial survey had suggested. Massive coral formations created natural corridors that stretched deep into the ocean floor. Sarah methodically documented each section, taking photographs and collecting samples while maintaining constant communication with the surface team through her underwater radio system. About 40 minutes into the dive, everything changed in an instant. A powerful underwater current, much stronger than anything their weather monitoring equipment had detected, suddenly swept through the cave system. Sarah found herself being pulled deeper into the cave network, far beyond the planned dive route. She tried to swim against the current, but it was impossibly strong, dragging her through narrow passages and into completely uncharted territory. Her underwater radio crackled with static as Dr. Chen's voice became increasingly distorted. "Sarah, we're losing your signal. What's your location?" But the cave walls were interfering with the radio transmission, and soon all communication was lost. The current continued to pull her deeper, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that she was becoming completely disoriented in the maze of underwater tunnels. Fighting panic, Sarah tried to retrace her path. But the cave system was far more complex than they had realized from the surface. Every tunnel looked the same, and the powerful currents made it nearly impossible to maintain control of her movements. Her air supply, which should have been sufficient for a 2-hour dive, was being consumed much faster than normal due to her increased exertion and stress. Above the surface, Dr. Chen and Captain Rodriguez were becoming increasingly worried. Sarah's dive computer had stopped transmitting her location data, and repeated attempts to reach her by radio were unsuccessful. They immediately implemented emergency protocols, contacting the Coast Guard and preparing to send down another diver to search for her. But the underwater search proved futile. The current that had trapped Sarah was part of a complex underwater weather system that the research vessel's instruments had failed to detect. The search divers could not safely navigate the same cave system, and after hours of desperate searching, they found no trace of Sarah or her equipment. As night fell, the Coast Guard expanded the search area, bringing in additional vessels and underwater detection equipment. For 3 days, They scoured every possible area where Sarah might have surfaced. Helicopters flew search patterns over hundreds of square miles of ocean, while underwater drones explored the cave system as deeply as safely possible. The search teams found pieces of Sarah's equipment floating on the surface, including her dive computer and one of her underwater cameras, but there was no sign of Sarah herself. The evidence suggested that she had been trapped in the cave system and had likely drowned when her air supply ran out. Dr. Chen was devastated. He had worked with Sarah for years and considered her one of the most skilled divers he had ever known. Captain Rodriguez, who had seen many tragedies at sea in his long career, was equally shaken. Sarah had become like family to the entire research team during their months together. The official search was called off after a week when weather conditions deteriorated and the Coast Guard determined that survival was no longer possible. Sarah's family was notified of the tragic accident, and preparations began for a memorial service. Her parents, who lived in California, were heartbroken but took comfort in knowing that Sarah had died doing what she loved most. 3 weeks later, the memorial service was held at the small coastal church where Sarah had grown up. Her colleagues, family, and friends gathered to celebrate her life and her contributions to marine science. Dr. Chen gave a moving eulogy about her passion for ocean exploration and her dedication to protecting marine ecosystems. The research project was suspended indefinitely as the team struggled to cope with the loss of their colleague and friend. But unknown to everyone gathered at that memorial service, Sarah was still alive, trapped in an underwater air pocket deep within the cave system, fighting for survival with determination that would have amazed those who thought they had laid her to rest. Sarah had discovered the air pocket purely by accident, when her oxygen levels had reached dangerously low levels during that first terrifying day. She had been swimming frantically through the cave tunnels, looking for any way to reach the surface. The powerful current had pushed her into a narrow passage that opened into a small underwater cavern with a dome of air trapped at the top. Gasping and exhausted, Sarah had managed to remove her breathing apparatus and found that the air in the pocket was breathable, though stale and humid. The space was barely large enough for her to float with her head above water, but it was enough to keep her alive. The cavern was completely dark except for the faint glow from her waterproof flashlight, which she used sparingly to conserve the battery. The first few days were the hardest. Sarah had no food and only the small amount of emergency drinking water contained in her diving suit. She quickly realized that she would need to ration everything carefully if she had any hope of survival. The temperature of the water was cold enough to cause hypothermia, so she had to constantly move to keep her body temperature stable. Her emergency beacon had been damaged during her chaotic journey through the caves, but she managed to partially repair it using tools from her diving kit. The device would only transmit a signal intermittently, and she wasn't even sure if the signal could penetrate through the layers of rock above her. Still, she activated it every few hours, hoping against hope that someone might detect the weak transmission. The psychological challenge was perhaps even greater than the physical one. Sarah found herself talking aloud to maintain her sanity, reciting facts about marine biology and telling stories from her childhood to keep her mind active. She forced herself to maintain a routine, checking her equipment at specific times and doing exercises to keep her muscles from cramping in the confined space. On the 4th day, Sarah made a crucial discovery. During one of her careful explorations of the cavern, she found a small opening that led to another air pocket. This one was larger and contained a tiny freshwater seep that provided a few drops of clean water every hour. It wasn't much, but it was enough to extend her survival time significantly. Sarah also realized that the cave system had a complex ecosystem of its own. Small fish and crustaceans lived in the deeper pools, and she learned to catch them with her bare hands. The raw seafood was hardly appetizing, but it provided essential protein and nutrients. She even discovered some edible algae growing on the cave walls that, while bitter and slimy, helped supplement her meager diet. Meanwhile, above the surface, life was slowly returning to normal for everyone who had known Sarah. Dr. Chen had returned to his university to teach, carrying with him the weight of guilt over the accident. Captain Rodriguez had taken a new research assignment, though he found it difficult to focus on his work. Sarah's parents had started the painful process of settling her affairs, donating her research materials to the marine biology department where she had studied. The Coast Guard had officially closed the case, filing Sarah's disappearance as a diving accident with no survivors. The research vessel, Deep Current, had been reassigned to a different project in the Atlantic Ocean. The underwater cave system where Sarah had vanished was marked as a hazardous area on navigation charts, warning other researchers to avoid the dangerous currents. But Sarah's emergency beacon continued its intermittent transmissions, sending out weak signals that traveled through the water and rock above her hiding place. The signals were too faint to be detected by standard Coast Guard monitoring equipment, and they came at irregular intervals that made them difficult to track. 2 weeks into her underground imprisonment, Sarah faced her darkest moment. Her flashlight battery had finally died, leaving her in complete darkness. The constant cold and dampness had given her a persistent cough, and she was beginning to suffer from malnutrition despite her careful rationing. She had lost considerable weight, and her diving suit hung loosely on her shrinking frame. It was during this low point that Sarah began to doubt whether anyone was still looking for her. She knew that official searches were typically called off after a few days, and she assumed that her family and colleagues had already given up hope. The thought of dying alone in the darkness, with no one knowing her final resting place, was almost unbearable. But Sarah's scientific training had taught her to approach problems methodically, even in the most desperate circumstances. She began to explore the cave system more systematically, mapping out the connected air pockets and underwater passages in her mind. She discovered that the caves extended much further than she had initially realized, with several branching tunnels that she hadn't yet explored. In one of these unexplored passages, Sarah made an encouraging discovery. The tunnel seemed to lead upward, and she could detect a slight current of fresher air flowing through it. This suggested that there might be another opening to the surface somewhere above her. However, the passage was partially flooded and would require a dangerous underwater swim to explore fully. Sarah spent days preparing for this risky exploration. She practiced holding her breath for extended periods and carefully planned her route through the flooded sections. She knew that if she became lost in these new tunnels, she would have no way to return to her original air pocket, which had become her base of survival. The exploration was terrifying but ultimately successful. Sarah discovered that the cave system was much more extensive than anyone had realized from the surface surveys. She found 3 additional air pockets, including one that was large enough for her to lie down completely out of the water. More importantly, this larger cavern showed signs of occasional tidal influence, suggesting that it was connected to the ocean through openings that were sometimes above water during low tide. Sarah also realized why her rescue had been so difficult. The entrance she had been swept through was nearly impossible to find from the outside, hidden behind rock formations that made it invisible from the surface. The currents that had trapped her were caused by a complex system of underwater channels that created unpredictable water flows throughout the cave network. Her emergency beacon, despite its damaged condition, had been faithfully transmitting its weak distress signal throughout her entire ordeal. The signal was bouncing through the water-filled caves and occasionally reaching the surface, but it was too faint and irregular for standard search equipment to detect. However, the persistent transmissions were about to catch the attention of someone with much more sophisticated listening equipment than the Coast Guard had access to. 3 weeks after Sarah had vanished beneath the waves, a Navy SEAL training exercise was taking place 200 miles from her location. The SEALs were testing new underwater communication equipment that was far more sensitive than anything previously available. Their advanced listening devices were designed to detect the faintest underwater sounds and electronic signals for military reconnaissance purposes. During one of their training sessions, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson noticed an unusual electronic signature on his equipment. The signal was extremely weak and appeared only intermittently, but it had the distinctive pattern of a personal emergency beacon. Thompson was puzzled because there were no current distress calls in the area, and the signal seemed to be coming from a location that had been searched weeks earlier. Petty Officer Thompson brought the unusual signal to the attention of his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison, who had 15 years of experience in underwater rescue operations. Harrison listened to the recorded signal and immediately recognized its importance. The intermittent pattern and frequency signature matched that of a standard emergency beacon, but the signal was so weak that it had clearly been transmitting for an extended period. "This doesn't make sense," Harrison told his team as they gathered around the monitoring equipment. "According to our records, there are no active distress calls in this area and no missing persons reports for at least 3 weeks. The SEAL team quickly cross-referenced the signal location with recent maritime incidents and discovered the case of Sarah Martinez, the marine biologist who had been declared dead after the extensive Coast Guard search. The location of the intermittent signal matched almost exactly with the coordinates where Sarah had disappeared, though it seemed to be coming from much deeper underwater than anyone had previously searched. Harrison made an immediate decision that would save Sarah's life. Despite the official closure of the case and the assumption that no survivors could possibly remain after 3 weeks, he ordered his team to investigate the signal source. The SEALs had access to deep-diving equipment and underwater navigation technology that was far superior to what the Coast Guard had used during the original search. "If there's even a 1% chance that someone is still alive down there, we're going in," Harrison told his team. The SEALs began immediate preparations for a deep-water rescue mission, using their advanced sonar mapping equipment to create detailed charts of the underwater cave system that had never been properly explored. Meanwhile, Sarah was facing her greatest challenge yet. Her makeshift diet of raw fish and algae had kept her alive, but she was severely weakened by malnutrition and the constant cold. She had developed a persistent infection in one of her hands where she had cut herself on sharp rocks, and the wound was becoming increasingly painful without proper medical treatment. Sarah had also begun to notice that the tidal patterns in her main cavern were changing. The water level was rising higher during high tide, reducing the size of her air pocket. She realized with growing alarm that the cave system might be seasonal, and that winter storms could potentially flood her refuge completely. Time was running out faster than she had realized. On the day of the rescue attempt, Sarah was resting in her largest air pocket when she heard something that made her heart race with hope and fear. Through the water-filled tunnels, she could hear the distant sound of mechanical equipment. At first, she thought she might be hallucinating from her weakened condition, but the sounds grew stronger and more distinct. The SEAL team had located the hidden entrance to the cave system using their advanced sonar equipment. Thompson and 2 other experienced divers entered the water with underwater cutting tools, high-powered lights, and enough emergency air supplies to reach any survivor they might find. They followed the electronic signal from Sarah's beacon, which grew stronger as they descended deeper into the cave network. The rescue swim was dangerous even for the highly trained SEALs. The cave system was more complex than their sonar had indicated, with numerous dead ends and confusing passages. The currents that had trapped Sarah were still active, requiring the divers to use mechanical anchors and guide ropes to maintain their position and ensure they could find their way back out. When Thompson's powerful underwater light finally illuminated the opening to Sarah's main air pocket, he could hardly believe what he saw. After nearly 3 weeks underwater, Sarah was alive, conscious, and alert enough to respond to his signals. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous, and Thompson later said it was the most emotionally powerful moment of his military career. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Thompson with the U.S. Navy," he called out as he surfaced in Sarah's cramped air pocket. "We received your distress signal. We're here to get you out of here." Sarah's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by overwhelming relief. She had begun to think that she would never see sunlight again, and the appearance of a rescuer seemed almost like a dream. Her voice was hoarse and weak from weeks of minimal use, but she managed to explain her condition and the layout of the cave system that she had learned during her imprisonment. The rescue operation required careful planning because of Sarah's weakened condition and the dangerous route back to the surface. The SEALs had to provide Sarah with emergency diving equipment and guide her through the flooded passages, but her knowledge of the cave system proved invaluable in finding the safest route out. Thompson was amazed by Sarah's mental resilience and scientific approach to her survival. Even in her desperate situation, she had methodically mapped the cave system, identified food and water sources, and maintained detailed observations about the tidal patterns and currents. Her scientific training had literally saved her life. The swim back to the surface took over an hour and required 3 different air stops in pockets that Sarah had discovered during her weeks of exploration. When Sarah finally broke the surface of the ocean and saw sunlight for the first time in 3 weeks, she was so overwhelmed that she could barely speak. The rescue helicopter arrived within minutes, and Sarah was immediately airlifted to a hospital for emergency medical treatment. She was suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, and multiple infections, but doctors were amazed that she was conscious and alert after her ordeal. The news of Sarah's rescue spread rapidly through both the scientific community and the general media. The story of a marine biologist who had survived for 3 weeks in an underwater cave captured the public's imagination and highlighted the importance of never giving up hope in rescue situations. Dr. Chen was teaching a class when he received the phone call about Sarah's rescue. He was so shocked that he had to sit down to process the information. Captain Rodriguez was equally stunned when he heard the news while working on his new research vessel. Both men immediately changed their plans to rush to the hospital where Sarah was recovering. Sarah's parents had been planning to donate her research equipment to the marine biology department when they received the call that their daughter was alive. Her mother later said that hearing Sarah's voice on the telephone was the most beautiful sound she had ever experienced. The reunion at the hospital was emotional for everyone involved. Sarah's colleagues and family members who had attended her memorial service just days earlier were overwhelmed to see her alive and recovering. Sarah herself was deeply moved to learn how many people had been affected by her disappearance and had continued to remember her even after the official search had ended. The Navy SEALs received official recognition for their rescue operation, but Thompson later said that the real hero was Sarah herself. Her determination to survive and her scientific approach to problem-solving in an impossible situation had made the rescue possible. Sarah's experience led to significant improvements in emergency beacon technology and underwater search procedures. Her detailed observations of the cave system contributed to new understanding of underwater currents and cave formation, advancing the field of marine geology. Most importantly, her survival story became an inspiration to researchers and rescue workers around the world, proving that even in the most desperate circumstances, human determination and scientific knowledge can overcome seemingly impossible odds. 3 months after her rescue, Sarah returned to diving, though she now carries multiple emergency beacons and never dives alone. She continues her research in marine biology, with a new appreciation for both the dangers and the incredible resilience of life in the ocean's depths. The cave system where she survived has been thoroughly mapped and is now used as a training site for advanced rescue operations, ensuring that her experience will help save other lives in the future.